or spiritual powers. Now, a lot of people don't realize that they have spiritual powers. So Adi-Baha talked about this. You know your body has certain powers. And we call the powers of the body, the 5 physical powers, as the 5 senses. What are the 5 senses of the body? They are the sense of sight, the sense of hearing, the sense of touch, the sense of taste, and the sense of smell. Is that right? The body has 5 powers. The important thing to remember is this, is that these 5 powers each see different parts of the world. Or in other words, they experience different parts of the world. None of the senses do what the other senses cannot do. So for example, your eyes can see. Your ears can hear, but can your eyes hear? Can your ears see? You understand? Your nose smells. Nothing else can do it. They say your feet smell too, but that's a different kind of thing. But your nose, in other words, every sense doesn't overlap with the other senses. And if you don't use any one of the senses, you miss out on a whole part of the physical world. So the physical senses make you realize that the world itself is multifaceted, and you need to get certain things through your ears, certain things through your eyes, certain things through your nose, certain things through your mouth, and so on. And so we have 5 physical senses, or physical powers. And Adi-Baha said that there are 5 physical senses, there are also 5 spiritual. Now a lot of us think that our spiritual powers are just one thing. You just have a soul and it flies around like a ghost or something. We don't realize that the soul has certain things. It has eyes and ears and hands and so on. And the physical body is a mirror or reflection of the soul, and the soul has many things. If I try to use the wrong sense on something, I'm not going to get. So if I had a, how many of you like a big chocolate sundae? Who likes that? Do you have that? Chocolate ice cream with chocolate on? Okay, what if I gave you the chocolate sundae and I held it in front of you and said, look at it for as long as you can? Okay? Are you going to get much benefit from looking at it? Okay, so instead take it and listen to it. Okay? Is it going to have any effect? Maybe it'll freeze your ear, but it's not going to, until you taste it. Isn't that right? But in the same way, if I ask you to taste, something that's music. In other words, all the things, they're all different. And you have to use the right sense at the right time. Now, Adi-Baha says that we have 5 spiritual senses, and we must learn to develop them, because we're going to need them in the next world, because we're not going to have our hands and our feet and our eyes and our ears, our physical ones. But there are spiritual eyes, and there are spiritual ears. All of the religions have always used the analogy that physical senses have their spiritual counterpart. All of the religions. Here you read this in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, and so on. For example, Jesus said, "He that hath an eye to see, let him see. He that hath an ear to hear, let him hear." And he often referred to those that were spiritually incapable. He referred to them as having a physical illness. For example, he would refer to people being blind. And of course, blind means that you've lost the sense of sight. But he wasn't talking about people that didn't have physical sight. He was talking about those that didn't have spiritual sight. Okay? And other times he would talk about those that are deaf. But he wasn't talking about those that were physically deaf. He was talking about those that are spiritually deaf. Or he would talk about lepers, or leprosy. And of course, leprosy is the illness of the loss of the sense of touch. That's the primary symptom of leprosy. So in all cases, he's referring to illnesses that deprive you of a physical sense as being a spiritual deprivation. And Baha'u'llah does the same thing. He says, that people in the world are not able to see God with their own eyes or hear His melody with their own ears. In other words, you have these spiritual powers. Therefore, you must learn to open your spiritual eyes. You must learn to open your spiritual ears. You must have spiritual touch. You must have spiritual taste. In other words, there are 5 spiritual powers, and I have come to realize gradually that all 6 of these things that we need to learn to do daily, we need to do them with our spiritual powers, not just our physical powers. We don't realize this. Now, the first spiritual power, Adi-Baha says, is imagination. Imagination, or the ability to conceive something visually inside your mind. This is the first spiritual power. It's a power that apparently only humans have. Animals do not have this power, the power of visualization or imagination. And this is the first sign of a spiritual being. If you close your eyes right now, go ahead and close your eyes. I want you all to keep your eyes closed, and I want you to see a red apple. Can you see it in your mind?
Yeah.
How come you see it? Because there's no red apple there. Okay? I want you to imagine in your mind's eye, keep your eyes closed, and go to the refrigerator in your house, imaginarily, and open the refrigerator and feel the cold coming out of the refrigerator on you. And you can feel it. Now, I want you to reach in and grab that red apple that's inside the refrigerator, and it's hard and firm, and squeeze it and feel how cold it is, because it's been in the refrigerator. And now take the apple and put it to your nose and sniff it. Okay? Now it smells a certain way, and I want you to take the apple and I want you to slice it with a knife, and it's juicy, and now smell the inside of the apple, the juice. And now take it and take a bite of it and chew it. Now open your eyes right now. How many of you could feel the cold of the refrigerator? How many of you felt the cold on the hand as you squeezed the hard apple? How many of you smelled the apple? How many of you tasted the apple? In fact, this is very common, and all the religious disciplines have practiced this art of visualization, because we realize that the human soul, or the human mind, does not need eyes and ears and nose and mouth to see and hear and touch and taste. We don't need it. There is some other power that we have, which is a physical thing translated to the spirit. And so the spirit has this power of imagination, and we can use it very well to our spiritual advantage. Now when you go to the next world, these spiritual eyes and ears will be awakened. Because when you're in the physical world now, you may not realize how powerful it is. In the same way that when you're in the womb of the baby, when you're a baby in the womb, you don't realize how powerful your physical eyes are until you come out. So developing your spiritual powers of imagination is one of the first steps towards becoming spiritual. And I'm going to talk to you how you can use this power. We call it visualization, but visualization is not the correct word. Because visualization in English means you can see something in your mind. But what you really need to do is be able to taste something in your mind, or to smell something in your mind, or to hear something in your mind, and so on. And we don't have a word in English for that, because visualize comes from revision. To imagine, which is another word, comes from image, which is also visually oriented. They tell me that the Indians have words that mean to hear inside. Some Indians told me this. Is this true? Does anyone speak Hindi? Because the Indians are more auditorily oriented. But in English we don't have a word like to audioize or to hear. We don't have anything like inner smell, to smellize or something like that. We don't have it. So, but the spiritual powers, the first one of imagination, as Adabaha says, is to somehow in your mind's eye be able to see, hear, touch, taste within your mind. And that's the first step, imagination. The second, Adabaha says, is thought. Imagine is thought. It's reflection, the ability to think and reflect upon things. Now these two qualities the animals do not have the way we have it. We've studied animals, they're very intelligent in many ways, but for some reason they cannot, for example, symbolize. Symbolization has the ability to look at something and realize it represents something else. Okay? If we didn't have symbolizing, but many animals, they can't even recognize a life-size photograph of another animal. Did you know that? They have to have the whole real animal there. The life-size photograph doesn't work for most animals. A human being can draw a stick figure, just like a cross and two legs, and we know it represents a human being. Because this is some ability to symbolize. We have this idea. Symbolization is the ability to transcend from the physical to the spiritual, because we understand this. It's just a human characteristic. Thought is the second spiritual capacity, in which you could just sit around and think. You don't need any physical body. You could be laying in what they call a sensory deprivation tank, in which they put you in a tank and they suspend you in heavy salt water so that you can't feel, and they close everything. You have no sense of gravity, no sense of light, no sense of sound. And they find that you have more spiritual and more visual. Your thought process is even greater when they deprive it. So this is thought. The third, Adabaha says, is comprehension. Comprehension is a third spiritual power, the ability to understand something after it has gone through the process of imagination and then comprehension, imagination, then thought, and then comprehension. Now, I like to think that imagination is the spiritual equivalent of eyes. This is only my own guess, because I don't have, there's 5 spiritual, there's 5 physical and 5 spiritual. It doesn't say which one corresponds. But I like to think that imagination is like inner sight. And I like to think that thought is like reflection, which is inner hearing. And then he says comprehension is the third one. And I think that's like tasting. I don't know why. I just think it's like tasting. Or eating or something. It could be smelling. I'm not quite sure. And then he says there's another one, and that's memory. He says memory is a spiritual power. Most of us don't think that memory is a spiritual power. And we don't realize how powerful it is, that somehow you can store something. It's like hitting the save button on the computer. Have any of you ever typed a big long document and forgot to hit save? Has that ever happened to you? And it's just gone. And you look at the computer, where is it? And it's gone. Did you hate that? Okay. The human being has a save button on the computer. It's amazing. And the human capacity for memory is much greater than most people realize. There are people that have memorized the whole Bible. There are people that have memorized the entire Quran, which is even bigger than the Bible. Did you know that? Little children, often when they go to school, are put in a play when they're like 6 or 7 or 8, and they have to memorize all their lines. And they come home and they say, I have to memorize all of this for the play. And they fret. And then they find that the children learn those lines within a few days. And the children are always amazed. And this happens all over the world every year. Children are amazed how quick they learn the lines. There's actually a scientific reason why children can learn lines so well. I can explain it to you later, but it doesn't matter. The point is that you don't realize how powerful your memory is. And we're told to memorize the words of God. You know, there's a great emphasis even in the Ruhi Institute to memorize. And this is a great spiritual capacity. In fact, I have a group of friends of mine that we try to memorize, certain prayers. We've memorized long prayers like the long healing prayer and all the Tablet of Ahmad and various things long. And we're always inspired by a story that was told to me a long time ago by Joy Stevenson, who some of you know from Australia. She was a counselor. And she said there was a Baha'i lady who, in her elderly period, she went into a coma. You know how some people go into a coma? And she remained in a coma for a very long period of time. I don't know exactly how long, but months or maybe even years. And while she was in this coma, the Baha'is would come and sit there, and visit. And some people say that if you talk to people in the coma, they can still hear it and so on. So they visited her and so on. And she said one day, while this lady was in a coma, suddenly she started reciting the Tablet of Ahmad. Perfectly, out loud. So they rushed to get the doctors. She's finally out of the coma. Doctors came rushing, all the people came in, and she recited, and she finished the Tablet of Ahmad and then went back into the coma. She was just, in the coma, and she recited the whole Tablet of Ahmad perfectly. And she actually never came out of the coma. She passed away. And when I heard this story, and Joy Stevenson is not a airy-fairy spirit. She's a very practical person, and when she told the story, I was quite amazed. And I said, I would love to know the Tablet of Ahmad that well, that even in a coma, I could say it, even in a coma. So I told this story to our meditation group that we have in Tennessee. And then when they were starting to memorize prayers, they would come to the class and we would say, how is your prayer, memorizing of this prayer doing? And they said, well, it's not coma ready yet. And then one day one guy came and he said, I've got this prayer, I think it's coma ready. So we use that term now to say until you've got it ready for a coma, but I don't really know. We're not going to test it. But the thing is that this is a wonderful thing. If you could know a prayer that well, that's amazing. So memory is the other one. And then the last one he says is a spiritual power that he refers to in different tablets, different ways. One time he calls it the common faculty. Another place he calls it the sympathetic nerve. And basically there is one power physically that's the king of all the powers. One power in your physical body is the king of all powers, and Baha'u'llah praised his power, and it's the sense of touch. The sense of touch is actually greater than just touching with your finger. It is this whole central nervous system of the body And Baha'u'llah says, consider how all the other senses are localized. The ears are here, the eyes are here. But the sense of touch, he says, is in every part of your body, inside and out. And if we actually analyze this particular sense, it completely interconnects your entire body. If you look, there's just millions and millions of neural pathways in which electricity runs, and every single part of your body is connected to your brain through this wonderful sense, this what we call the central nervous system. You understand? And if it weren't for this, nothing else could work. In fact, the other 4 powers can't even work without this, because the eyes actually need the nerves, the ears need the nerves, and so on. So every sense requires this. This is the king of senses, and it is the coordinator of the senses. Adi-Baha says the spiritual has also this sense. And he calls it the common faculty, he says, because this spiritual power connects this body to the soul. The body to the soul are connected. So he says that if the eyes see something, they want to get it to the soul, it has to go into the brain and then into this sympathetic nerve, and then that gives it to the imagination and the comprehension and so on. In other words, the communication goes through that. It's kind of like the central hub. It's the nervous system that connects the soul and the body. Because there has to be some way in which, how is your soul connected to your body otherwise? It has to have some means of doing so. And Adi-Baha called this in one passage the sympathetic nerve. It's a certain nerve. So you have 5 spiritual capacities, and Adi-Baha describes that you need to use them in sequence. He says that you see something and you use your imagination on it, reflect upon it. Then you see it and you imagine it. Then you reflect upon it. You keep reflecting on what you imagine until you come to some insight, and then you comprehend it. And once you comprehend it, then you memorize it. Now, we don't train our children to use our spiritual powers. When we go to school, we ask the children a question, and the child that raises their hand first and answers it, we say, very good, we praise them. So we train our children to quickly just try and learn something. We don't say go through, first imagine it and visualize it, then reflect upon it. And you understand? We just say, do this. Some of us, we don't want to do that either. So we actually do not train our children to go through the spiritual process that have to do it. Sometimes we just say to our children, don't imagine it, don't reflect upon it, just comprehend it. Sometimes we even say, don't imagine it, don't reflect upon it, don't even comprehend it, just memorize it. Just go to the formula. Isn't that right? Sometimes we do that to ourselves when we're studying for exam. We don't reflect upon it, we don't imagine upon it, we don't comprehend it. That would be kind of like if someone came to you and said, I'm going to blindfold you and plug your nose and just open your mouth and eat whatever I put in your mouth. Well, how many of you would do that? You have to really trust the person, isn't that right? And that's what we're doing to our children. And so, basically, using your spiritual powers is learning to do those things. So let's apply these to the 6 things that we must do. First of all, prayer. Prayer is dependent on visualizing that you're in the presence of God. This is the essential aspect of prayer according to Abdu'l-Baha, because one Baha'i in New York City came to Abdu'l-Baha and said, will you teach me how to pray? And he said, of course I can, but not here. Come to my apartment tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. and I'll teach you how to pray. So he was very excited because Abdu'l-Baha was going to teach him how to pray. So he gets up before the sun rises because he has to cross the city of New York. And he travels there and he gets to Abdu'l-Baha's apartment or hotel room, and he notices the door is slightly ajar. So he knocks on the door and the door just opens. And he goes in and he sees that Abdu'l-Baha is already praying. So he comes in, he sits down, trying to get Abdu'l-Baha's attention. And Abdu'l-Baha just keeps praying. So he says, okay, well, maybe I better pray too. So he starts to pray alongside Abdu'l-Baha silently. And he says all the prayers that he knows. And then he turns and Abdu'l-Baha's still praying. So he says, okay. So he says all the prayers he knows again. And Abdu'l-Baha's still praying. And then he says all the prayers for every one of his family members. And he turns and Abdu'l-Baha's still praying. Then he said he prayed for every crowned head of Europe. He said, Abdu'l-Baha's still praying. And as he's sitting down on his knees, as he's praying, his knees really start to ache, and he's rubbing his knees, and his back starts to ache. He's rubbing his back. And then he looks at the wall, and he sees the crack in the wall. He says, he notices the crack in the wall. Then the city starts to wake up and he hears the sound of the birds outside and the traffic in the city going and listens to that. And he's rubbing his legs and it's like, he looks at Ada Baha still praying. And he's doing all this for a little while. And then suddenly he looks at Ada Baha and he realizes that Ada Baha is completely lost, completely oblivious. And something hits him and he says, oh. So then he turns and prays this way. And as soon as he does it, Ada Baha stops. He says, good. He says, good. He says, when you pray, you must not think about your sore knees and your sore back. And you must not think about the crack in the wall. And you must not think about the birds or the traffic outside. He said this, exactly what it was. He said, when you pray, you must see yourself in the presence of the Almighty. And then he walked out, and that was the end. In other words, that was the whole lesson. He didn't teach him anything else, just one thing is that when you pray. Now, to see yourself in the presence of God requires visualization or imagination. It's a spiritual sense, because is God physically, here's God, hey come on God, He's not there. You have to bring Him in somehow in your imagination, in your mind. But when you're in the presence of somebody, it affects your behavior very much. If anybody important is in the room, you're sitting in the room and do you have a prime minister or president? What do you have in this country? Prime minister. Okay, if the prime minister came into the room, okay, into your house, would you give him attention? Would you act differently? Would you check your email or, comb your hair or talk to your friend? No, even if Ada Baha walked in the room, would you check your email or would you talk to your friend or would you give him all your attention? We behave according to who's in our presence. If you're at home alone, you do certain things, but if guests are in the house, you behave differently, isn't that right? So you don't have to change behavior, you have to change your consciousness of the fact that God is present. And so this is the first step. And so when we read the Baha'i writings, we find that all of the prayers are couched in physical terms. Every Baha'i prayer uses physical things. Oh God, rain down upon us from the clouds of thy heaven, or from the sweet scented streams of thine eternity, or give me to drink. Or have you noticed that? They're all physical things? But are you actually asking God to actually put rain on you? Or to drink water? Or immerse me in the ocean? Or, make my prayer a fire? Do you understand that? No. They're all physical things that are used as symbols to represent spiritual things, because the physical world represents the spiritual. And I have found that if every time you see a physical thing in a Baha'i prayer, to always see that physical thing in your mind. And not just see it, taste it, smell it, whatever. Because you'll notice that Baha'u'llah is an equal opportunity sensory perception. He will say, let me gaze on your beauty. Let me gaze on the beauty of God. Or other times he'll say, taste the sweetness of God. Or he might say, inhale the fragrance of God, or touch the hem of the robe. Have you noticed this? He uses all the senses. In other words, you have to taste God, you have to hear God, you have to see God, you have to eat God, and so on. I'm serious. It's there. In fact, we can talk about this more. And so, if it says in the writings, hearken to the delightsome words of my honeyed tongue. Have you see that in the hidden words? I want you to taste honey from Baha'u'llah. Who can taste honey right now? Can anyone taste it in their mouth? Okay, anytime you see honey tongue, in other words, Baha'u'llah's words are like honey. They're spiritual honey, and so on. And so you're using visualization. The same when you meditate on the writings. Because when you meditate using visualization, truth will come to you. This has been known in science for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that when you visualize and meditate, Einstein, for example, Albert Einstein discovered the nature of time and gravity and space in the universe. Do you know that? He figured out all these things. Did you know that he didn't have a laboratory? He didn't have any equipment? Do you know he did it all with his mind? And Einstein said there was only one way in which he did it. He said he just visualized or imagined what it would be like to be like a beam of light. He said he only had one technique. He always imagined what it would be like to be a beam of light and put himself in that frame of reference. And he would keep meditating upon that. Now you would think if you meditated upon I'm being a being of light, that it would just be pure imagination. I would just come up with any old thing. but it's not true because Adabaha says imagination is a spiritual power. Einstein was actually going into the spiritual world by using visualization. He said that was his only technique. He used visualization. Now, when Einstein died, and by the way, he died in Princeton, New Jersey in late 1955. Princeton, New Jersey is just about 30, 40 miles from New York City in late 1955. And when he died, he wanted his body to be cremated. It was in his will. He wanted his body to be cremated. And the guy at Princeton University, what do we call this person? Is it the, whatever, the mortician, took his brain and stole it. They stole his brain. Because he said, this brain is too important to be burnt, we want to study it. So he took his brain and he stole it. Now the interesting thing is that about 40 miles away, just a month or two later, in a hospital in New York, another baby was born just after Einstein died, and that baby was me. I was born in New York City. I was born in New York City just a few months. So one goes out and one comes in. I don't understand. I just thought it was interesting when I read this. This man stole the brain, and the family were so upset that they sued Princeton University, and Princeton then fired the man. And so the man was interviewed in the newspaper. He said, but it was the most valuable brain, and we could learn, you know, what is it about this brain and so on. And so on. And the newspaper publicity was so great that the family turned completely around and forgave him and asked the university to rehire him, and he got his job back. And so then he got to keep the brain, and he kept it for the whole rest of his life and never gave it to anybody. And he lost his job, and he kept it in a jar and drove all around America in the car with Einstein's brain in the car. And he only died fairly recently, and finally they got Einstein's brain back. You see what I mean? And they analyzed it, you know, and it's recently been published that Einstein's brain was perfectly normal in most ways, but one part of the brain was much larger than the average person. And it would happen to be the part of the brain that controls imagination and visualization. That he had a bigger part of it. And of course we knew that Einstein used visualization to do this. And so they immediately started to ask, well, was this the chicken or was this the egg? In other words, was he born with this big part of the brain and that's why he became like he was? Or did he keep using that and it got bigger? You know, in other words, like, is it a muscle that if you use? And of course, we're still trying to figure it out, but we know now, and we learned this many ways, like, for example, Philo Farnsworth, the young high school student who at the age of 14 was plowing potato fields in Idaho. He just 14 years old, plowing potato fields. And as he was plowing them, he was thinking about an electrical circuit, and he visualized television. And so he went to his high school teacher and described what he visualized, you know, in the potato fields of Idaho. The high school teacher wrote it down. And of course, later on, they developed it into television. Now, later on, the greatest scientists of the day from Moscow University worked for RCA, and they also created television. And they tried to get a patent, and it went to the US Supreme Court to see who was the first to invent television. And they looked at the notes of this 14-year-old boy, and they said, he gets the patent. He was awarded by the US Supreme Court because through visualization, and all science comes from this, that your imagination can see reality. So every time you read the hidden words, and it says something like, in the garden of thine heart, plant naught but the rose of love, think very carefully about what is the relationship of a garden and a heart and soil and growth and so on. Because this imagination leads to comprehension. He says that he has every atom in existence has been created for your training. But a lot of us just read the garden of thine heart, plant not but the rose of love, and we think it's just flowery language, literally, and we're just saying something nice. In fact, there are principles in soil and life and so on. And so we are given the physical world to visualize and meditate upon it. And when we get the Baha'i writings, we are told that the Word of God that you have to read every day is compared to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things. There are 9 things that I wrote down here that the Word of God is associated with. The first of all is associated with power. Second, it's associated with a seed. Third, a talisman. Fourth, an elixir. 5, food. 6, water. 7, breath. 8, ocean. 9, city. Now let's look at each of these, because the Word of God is all of these things. First of all, let's look at power. Baha'u'llah says every single letter proceeding out of our mouth is endowed with such regenerative power as to enable it to bring into existence a new creation. Okay? He says a creation the magnitude of which is inscrutable to all save God. So there's a power in the Word of God. For example, if you have a toaster and you don't plug it in and you put bread in it, what does the toaster do? Nothing? But if you plug it in, are you changing any part of the toaster? So how come it works? Because there's a power. You are like that. You have all the components that the toaster has, you know, spiritual, but you need to get the power. And so the Word of God is like plugging yourself in. The next thing he says, he compares the Word of God to a seed. Here's one. The Word of God may be likened unto a sapling whose roots have been implanted in the hearts of men. It is incumbent upon you to foster its growth through the living waters of wisdom, so that its root may be firmly fixed and its branches spread. And another passage says, sow the seeds of my wisdom in the pure soil of thy heart. What is the nature of a seed? It grows, so a seed has much more potentiality than you see, but it requires soil. And Baha'u'llah says, your heart is soil, and the Word of God is the seed. Okay? So there's some kind of mysterious interaction when you put that seed in your heart. So you say, oh, well, that's just a little passage here and there. You know, you go to your study circle and you have to read these quotes over and over again. And you say, it's just, you know, it's like a handful of seeds. But think of the power of a seed. That when you plant it in your heart, and you leave it there, it grows. So this is another thing. The third thing he says is the Word of God is an elixir. Have we already talked about an elixir? An elixir is something that has magical powers. The third, he says, it's a talisman. Who knows what a talisman is? Anyone know what a talisman is? What is it? It's a physical thing, like a small thing, that has magical powers. It's a little statue or it's a ring. Did you see Lord of the Rings? That's a talisman. And everybody wants a talisman. So they're all searching for the talisman. My little precious, or things like that. Okay, Baha'u'llah says the Word of God is that. That's the thing you should, it has magical powers. The next, he compares it to food. How many of you like food? You love it, isn't it? It's great. It's not just that it keeps you alive, but it also feels really good, isn't it right? He says the Word of God is like that. He also compares it to water. It's the water of life and so on. He compares it often to breath. B-R-E-A-T-H, breath. And many times we talk about the breath of our revelation. And you know that breath is the essential thing you need for life. How long can you go without eating? They say about 30 days maximum. You know, if you're heavy, you can go longer. If you're skinnier, you can go less. If you're very thin, you can only go 10 days. But most people cannot go longer than 30. How long can you go without drinking? And they say about 3 days. How long can you understand? How long can you go without breathing? They say most people no more than 90 seconds. You can go about 1.5 minutes. Now, certain divers can go maybe a little more. They practice, but most of you don't even try it. Well, you can try it if you want. The point is, so breath is the essential element to life. Wouldn't you agree? You cannot have anything that's more of a symbol of life than breath. And so, you know, when you first come out of the womb, you take that first breath, that is the essence of life. So it's no mystery that the word spirit and the word soul in our language originally came from the word breath. Did you know that? The word spirit and the word soul, if you look at the original Greek or you know, whatever Aramaic, whatever the language came from, spirit means breath, because breath is the essence of life. And so many times he talks about the breath of thy revelation. Have you seen that passage? In other words, God's holy word is like oxygen to your lungs, and you can't even go 90 seconds without it. And this is what the Word of God is like. He refers to the Word of God as an ocean. Basically, that an ocean is something that is huge, and there are many things hidden in its depths. So he says, immerse yourselves in the ocean. How many things are in the ocean? You know we don't know? They say we know more about the surface of Mars and the moon than we know about what's in our own ocean. Did you know that? Wait, you're laughing, but that's true. And there's so many things down there. And he says the Word of God is like an ocean. So right now on your bedside table, there is an ocean of things. There's pearls that are hidden there. And then he refers to the Word of God as a city. And I think I already talked about this. So this is the main. A city is something that protects you and keeps you safe and so on. Now, this means that we need to use our imagination and think about the Word of God as being a seed, as being water, as being food, and meditate and visualize this every day. And use imagination and visualization. Now, when you meditate, meditate on the physical analogies that the Baha'i writings give. You might notice that when I speak, I only use analogies. Have you noticed that? I do that on purpose because when I first started speaking about 4 or 5 years ago, before that I was only a musician. Nobody ever wanted me to speak. And, it's true, I'm very serious. And then I studied Abdu'l-Baha's speeches, and I found that he always gave an analogy for everything. And his analogies were always so interesting. Like if he wanted to talk about men and women being equal, he said they're like 2 wings of a bird. And when he said that analogy, everybody understood. 2 wings of a bird. 5 syllables, right? It's not very many, right? But any Baha'i that talks about equality of men